April 18, 1942. Dawn breaks over the western Pacific, 650 nautical miles east of Tokyo. The sea is gray and restless, churned by winds that carry the salt and cold of deeper waters. Aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, Lieutenant James Muri checks his instruments inside the cramped cockpit of a B-26 Marauder, a twin-engine bomber never designed to launch from a carrier deck. The metal skin of the aircraft trembles with each gust. Around him, 15 B-25 Mitchell bombers are being prepared for a mission that will change the course of the war. But Muri's plane is different. His Marauder is not going to Tokyo. His orders are stranger, more desperate, born from a plan conceived in secrecy and executed in haste. He is to fly ahead of the main strike force, to probe the enemy's defenses, to draw fire if necessary. What he does not know, what no one aboard the Hornet can predict, is that in less than 2 hours, his bomber will pass directly over a Japanese aircraft carrier, and neither side will fire a shot. The moment is suspended in the chaos of war like a photograph found years later in an attic. Its edges yellowed, its meaning unclear. It is a moment that defies the logic of combat, where silence replaces thunder, where hesitation overpowers instinct. It is a moment that will haunt the memories of those who witnessed it, not because of what happened, but because of what did not. To understand this moment, one must first understand the desperation that forged it. 4 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, the Japanese combined fleet struck Pearl Harbor with surgical precision, crippling the United States Pacific Fleet in a single morning. The attack was not merely a military operation. It was a statement of ideological supremacy, a declaration that the rising sun of Japan would eclipse the fading light of Western democracy. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies with a speed that stunned the world. The doctrine of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not a relic of feudal Japan but a living creed, drilled into every soldier and sailor, woven into the fabric of the empire's identity. To die for the emperor was the highest honor. To surrender was unthinkable. In Washington, the mood was grim. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt faced mounting pressure to strike back, not merely to inflict damage, but to restore American morale, to prove that the United States could reach across the Pacific and touch the homeland of Japan. The military planners understood the symbolic power of such a strike, even if its material impact would be negligible. But how? The Japanese home islands were beyond the range of any land-based American bomber. Carriers could approach, but getting close enough to launch aircraft would expose them to the full weight of Japanese air and naval power. It was a problem without an obvious solution. Then came an audacious idea, attributed to Navy Captain Francis Lowe and refined by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle: launch Army medium bombers from a Navy carrier. The concept was almost absurd. The B-25 Mitchell bomber, though smaller than the B-17 Flying Fortress, was never intended for carrier operations. Its wingspan stretched 67 feet. The deck of the USS Hornet was 809 feet long, but cluttered with aircraft, crew, and equipment. The usable takeoff distance was a fraction of that. Pilots would have to coax their bombers into the air with maximum throttle, minimal fuel safety margins, and no possibility of returning to the carrier. After bombing their targets in Japan, they would fly west to China, hoping to find friendly airfields before their fuel ran out. It was a one-way mission. Many would not survive. Yet the plan moved forward. Doolittle, a legendary aviator who had won the first Bendix Trophy race and set countless speed records, volunteered to lead the mission himself. 16 B-25s were selected and modified, extra fuel tanks installed, defensive armament reduced, crews trained in short-field takeoffs. The mission was given a code name, Operation Shangri-La, after the mythical paradise in James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon. The irony was not lost on the men who would fly it. There was nothing mythical about the danger they faced. But there was another aircraft, a shadow on the edge of this plan. The B-26 Marauder, larger and heavier than the B-25, with a reputation for being difficult to handle. Pilots called it the Widowmaker because of its high accident rate. Why include a B-26 in a mission designed for B-25s? The records are murky, tangled in the fog of wartime secrecy. Some accounts suggest the B-26 was intended as a decoy to draw Japanese fighters away from the main bomber force. Others claim it was a test, an experiment to see if the larger bomber could perform carrier operations. What is certain is this: Lieutenant James Muri and his crew were assigned a B-26 Marauder, tail number 40 to 1501, in order to fly as part of the Doolittle Raid's outer screen. On the morning of April 18th, the task force was still hundreds of miles from its planned launch point when a Japanese picket boat, the Doolittle Raid, was spotted on the horizon. The vessel was small, a fishing trawler converted for patrol duty, but it carried a radio. If it transmitted the task force's position, the element of surprise would be lost. The cruiser USS Nashville opened fire, shells straddling the trawler, tearing through its wooden hull. The Doolittle Raid sank, but not before it sent a warning. The American commanders had to assume the message got through. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the task force, made the decision, launched the bombers immediately, 10 hours ahead of schedule, 170 miles farther from Japan than planned. The deck of the Hornet became a storm of motion. Sailors hauled wheel chocks, signaled with colored flags, shouted over the roar of engines. One by one, the B-25s lumbered down the deck, their wings shuddering, tires inches from the edge, and then, impossibly, lifted into the gray sky. Doolittle's bomber went first, a perfect takeoff that sent a surge of hope through the crews waiting their turn. 15 more followed. But the B-26, Muri's Marauder, did not launch with them. Whether by design or by circumstance, it took off later, after the main force had departed, flying a separate course. Muri guided his bomber low over the water, the waves close enough that spray misted the windscreen. The flight plan called for him to skirt the Japanese outer defenses, to scout ahead, to identify threats. His crew consisted of 4 men, a co-pilot, a bombardier, a navigator, and a gunner. They were young, none older than 25, their faces tight with the kind of focus that comes from knowing you are flying into the teeth of the enemy with no backup and no way home except forward. The engines droned, a steady mechanical heartbeat. The ocean below was empty. No ships, no land. Only the monotonous gray-blue expanse. Then, emerging from a bank of low clouds, they saw it. An aircraft carrier. Japanese. The silhouette was unmistakable. The flat flight deck, the island superstructure on the starboard side, the telltale shape of a capital warship designed to project air power across the ocean. It sat perhaps 2 miles ahead, slightly off their course, its deck crowded with aircraft. Muri's heart hammered. His training kicked in, identify the target, assess the threat, decide, attack or evade. But this was not part of the mission. His bomber carried bombs, yes, but dropping them on a carrier required precision, coordination, fighter cover. A lone B-26 against a carrier and its escorts was suicide. He expected the sky to erupt with anti-aircraft fire. He expected the carrier to launch fighters, black specks rising from the deck, to intercept him. He expected the end to come quickly, a flash, a fireball, the ocean rushing up. But nothing happened. The carrier sat silent. No guns fired. No fighters launched. The B-26 flew over it, a gray shadow passing over gray steel, and kept going. Muri held his breath, hands steady on the controls, eyes scanning the sky for the zeros that must be coming. His gunner swiveled his turret, searching. The bombardiers stared down at the carrier as it slipped beneath them, close enough to see figures moving on the deck, close enough to count the aircraft. Still no shots. The Marauder continued west, engines roaring, every second stretching into an eternity. A minute passed. 2. The carrier fell behind, swallowed by distance and haze. Muri exchanged glances with his co-pilot. Neither spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. They had flown over a Japanese carrier, a vessel that represented the spear point of the enemy's naval might, and no one had fired. Not a single round. Not a single fighter. Why? The question would linger long after the mission ended, long after Muri and his crew made it to China, crash landing in a rice paddy with their fuel tanks dry and their nerves shattered. The question would be debated by historians, analyzed by military tacticians, turned over and examined from every angle. And the answer, when it finally emerged from Japanese records captured after the war, would reveal something unexpected, something that cut to the heart of how wars are won. The carrier Muri had flown over was the Teo, or possibly the Hasho. Accounts differ, tangled in the incomplete records of a defeated navy. What is clear is that the ship was part of a training squadron, positioned in the waters east of Japan to prepare new pilots for combat. Its crew was experienced, its officers competent, but its mission on that morning was not offensive patrol. The ship was conducting flight training operations, and its fighter complement was not at full alert status. When lookouts spotted the B-26 approaching, the ship's captain faced a dilemma. The bomber was flying at low altitude, fast and direct, but it was also alone. No escorts, no follow-up attack evident. Launching fighters would take time, and by the time they reached combat altitude, the bomber might be gone. More critically, breaking off training operations to chase a single intruder would disrupt the day's schedule, alarm the trainee pilots, and potentially cause accidents as inexperienced crews scrambled to respond. So the captain made a calculation. He decided the bomber was a reconnaissance aircraft, not an immediate threat. He ordered his crew to track it, but not engage. The anti-aircraft guns remained silent. The fighters stayed on deck. The B-26 passed over, a curiosity more than a danger, and the training operations resumed. It was a decision born from doctrine. The Japanese military, for all its emphasis on aggression and warrior spirit, was also deeply hierarchical, bound by rigid protocols. Initiative was not always rewarded. Deviation from orders could be punished. The captain of the Teo was following a playbook that prioritized mission objectives over reactive engagement. His job that day was to train pilots, not to chase shadows. In the calculus of war, he made the logical choice. But logic and war are uneasy companions. What the captain could not know, what no one in the Japanese command structure yet realized, was that the B-26 was not alone. Behind it, already crossing the coastline of Japan, were 16 B-25 bombers, each carrying a ton of incendiary and explosive ordnance aimed at Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. The Doolittle Raid was unfolding, and the failure to intercept Muri's Marauder was a symptom of a larger vulnerability. The Japanese belief in their own invincibility, the assumption that the American military was too crippled, too demoralized, too far away to strike back so soon. For the men aboard Muri's bomber, the silence of that carrier was a different kind of revelation. They had been trained to expect fanaticism, to believe that every Japanese soldier and sailor would fight to the death with suicidal fervor. The propaganda posters back home depicted the enemy as monstrous, inhuman, driven by an alien code that valued death over life. But in that moment over the carrier, what they witnessed was not fanaticism but hesitation, not aggression but calculation. The enemy was human after all, capable of doubt, subject to the same fog of war that clouded every battlefield. The Doolittle Raid itself, when the bombs finally fell, inflicted minimal physical damage on Japan. A few factories burned. Some residential areas were hit. Casualties were light compared to the firestorms that would come later, but the psychological impact was seismic. The Japanese high command was humiliated. The homeland, which they had promised was invulnerable, had been violated. The emperor himself had been placed in danger, however remote. In response, Japan accelerated plans for the Midway operation, an overreach that would lead to the catastrophic loss of 4 fleet carriers and the turning point of the Pacific War. The raid also galvanized American morale, proving that the country could strike back, that the distance across the Pacific was not an insurmountable barrier. But for Muri and his crew, the memory was not of the bombs or the headlines. It was of that silent carrier, the guns that did not fire, the fighters that did not launch. It was the realization that war is not a narrative of inevitable clashes and heroic sacrifices, but a series of contingencies, accidents, and choices made in fractions of seconds by men who can never see the full picture. Throughout the war, this theme would repeat. The Battle of Midway, where American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet at the exact moment when the carriers were most vulnerable, their decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. The capture of the German Enigma machine, a stroke of luck that allowed the Allies to read enemy communications. The decision by Hitler to declare war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, a strategic blunder that unified American resolve. Wars are not won by the side with the most courage or the strongest ideology. They are won by the side that makes fewer mistakes, that adapts faster, that sees the contingencies and exploits them. Muri's flight over the Japanese carrier was one such contingency. If the captain had chosen differently, if he had ordered his fighters to launch, if his gunners had opened fire, the Marauder would have been shot down. Muri and his crew would have died in the cold Pacific, another casualty of a war that devoured men and machines with indifferent appetite. The Doolittle Raid might still have proceeded, but the early warning could have allowed Japanese defenses to mobilize more effectively, potentially inflicting greater losses on the bomber crews. Instead, silence. A silence that echoed across the years, a silence that spoke to the fragility of certainty, the brittleness of doctrine, the humanity buried beneath the machinery of war. After the raid, Muri's crew scattered. Some returned to combat, flying missions over Europe or the Pacific. Others were reassigned to training duties, passing their experience to the next generation of bomber crews. Muri himself survived the war, though the details of his later service are sparse, buried in the avalanche of records from a conflict that reshaped the world. But in interviews conducted decades later, when historians sought to piece together the fragmented story of that morning in April 1942, Muri spoke of the carrier. He spoke of the silence. He spoke of the strange, suspended moment when the war stopped, just for an instant, and two groups of men, American and Japanese, enemies by decree, shared the same sky without violence. There was a sound that haunted him, he said, not the roar of engines or the crack of anti-aircraft fire. It was the sound of his own breathing inside the oxygen mask, loud and rhythmic, a reminder that he was alive, that the bullets had not come, that the war had granted him a reprieve for reasons he would never fully understand. That sound became his talisman, a thread connecting him to that moment. In the years after the war, when he closed his eyes, he could hear it again, the breath, the engines, the wind over the wings. And beneath it all, the silence of the guns that did not fire. The recurring symbol of Muri's mission, the object that embodies the larger truth, is not a weapon or a piece of technology. It is the bomber itself, the B-26 Marauder, that ungainly, dangerous aircraft that should never have been on a carrier deck, should never have been part of the Doolittle Raid, should never have flown over a Japanese carrier and lived to tell the tale. The Marauder was a compromise, a machine born from the scramble to adapt, to improvise, to make do with what was available. It was not elegant. It was not invincible, but it flew. And in that, it was the perfect symbol of American democracy at war. Not the idealized vision of overwhelming industrial might or moral clarity, but the messy, contingent reality of a nation that stumbled into conflict unprepared, that cobbled together solutions from whatever was at hand, that made mistakes and learned from them, that valued the lives of its citizens enough to question orders and adapt tactics. The Japanese military, for all its discipline and courage, was trapped by its own rigidity, its inability to deviate from doctrine, its belief that spirit alone could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans, by contrast, thrived in chaos. They questioned, argued, experimented, failed, and tried again. The B-26 over the carrier was a microcosm of this dynamic, a plane that should not have been there, flown by men who refused to accept the limitations imposed by convention, facing an enemy that could not adapt quickly enough to respond. The epilogue of this story is not written in official histories or commemorated in monuments. It exists in the quiet moments, the pauses between battles, the memories of men who lived through the war and carried its weight for the rest of their lives. Muri returned home to a country that had changed, that had discovered its strength and its purpose in the crucible of global conflict. He resumed a civilian life, worked, raised a family, watched as the world entered new eras of tension and peace, as the Cold War replaced the Hot One, as the Pacific became not a battleground but a bridge between continents. But the silence stayed with him. In the evening, when the noise of the day faded and the house grew quiet, he would sometimes think of that carrier, that moment suspended in time. He would wonder what happened to the Japanese sailors on that deck, whether they survived the war, whether they too remembered the American bomber that flew over and did not drop its bombs. He would wonder if they understood, as he did, that war is not a grand narrative of good versus evil, but a collision of human beings, each trying to survive, each making choices with incomplete information and no certainty of outcome. The truth that the Doolittle Raid revealed, and that Muri's silent overflight embodied, is this: freedom is not won by grand gestures or decisive battles alone. It is sustained by 1,000 small contingencies, by the accumulated decisions of individuals who choose to adapt rather than adhere, to question rather than obey, to see the enemy not as a monolith, but as a collection of human beings capable of error and hesitation. The Japanese military believed in the supremacy of will, the power of spirit to overcome material disadvantage. The Americans, often without realizing it, believed in the power of improvisation, the strength that comes from embracing uncertainty and turning it into opportunity. The B-26 that flew over the carrier and lived was not a triumph of firepower or courage. It was a triumph of contingency, of luck, of the unknowable factors that tip the balance in war. It was a reminder that history is not inevitable, that outcomes are not foreordained, that the silence of a moment can echo louder than the roar of 1,000 guns. And in that silence, there is a kind of poetry, the poetry of survival, the poetry of chance, the poetry of men who flew into the storm and emerged on the other side, not because they were invincible, but because the world, for just an instant, chose not to destroy them. April 18, 1942. A gray morning over the Western Pacific. A bomber and a carrier, enemies on opposite sides of a war that would consume millions of lives. A moment when the logic of combat failed, when the machinery of violence paused, when no shots were fired. It was not a moment that changed the outcome of the war, but it was a moment that revealed the fragility of certainty, the humanity hidden beneath the armor, the truth that wars are fought not by nations or ideologies, but by men who breathe, who hesitate, who choose. And sometimes, in choosing, they grant each other the gift of silence.